I am absolutely positively delighted that Cathy Connolly made the trip back to see us for this. Dr. Cathy Connolly, Ph.D., J.D. of the School of Culture, Gender, and Social Justice, recently retired from UW after 30 years of service. Over her career, Cathy was an award-winning teacher, helped to establish the Queer Studies minor, and achieved the rank of full professor. In 2008, Cathy was elected to serve in the Wyoming legislature, which she did for 14 years, including 3 terms as the minority floor leader. At both UW and the House of Representatives, Cathy was a tireless advocate for fair and equitable policies. And I have to say that Cathy was instrumental in helping to design the Democracy Lab. She was part of the advisory committee that worked seemingly endlessly for a year in order to figure out what this would be, what its curriculum would look like, how it would engage with the public. I'm deeply grateful for all of that. I also have to say personally that Cathy is a dear friend and mentor to me, and I'm so glad that she is here today. And please help me welcome Cathy Connolly.
All right. Thank you all, and thank you, Scott, for that incredibly warm welcome. I've been honored to be asked to participate in this year's Democracy Lab Symposium, the first of hopefully many to come. Congratulations to this year's participants, Aubrey, Charlie, Nicole, Robbie, Tennessee. Those presentations were incredible and provocative. And Robbie, you're going to find out why I want to steal your slides, okay? I was honored, as Scott said, to be one of the founding members of the DL. And as Scott would always say, noodle on its conceptions. What were our hopes and dreams for it? See, you all laugh because you hear about him talking about noodling, right? He noodles a lot, right? How it would be structured for whom, and you are the result. And your projects are really good, right? And I want to hear more about them in the last hour of today. So for my talk today, I want to talk about some of the new challenges that I see to democracy, particularly here in Wyoming, my adopted state. Admittedly, I watched way too much of the YouTube stream of the Wyoming legislature this year. I really did. And so for the legislators in the room, for Trey and for Chris, you can stop me and like say, oh, no, you've got that wrong. But I did. But before I get started, I want to tell you a bit about myself. Although I haven't always believed that the personal is or should be relevant to the work that we do. Some of that I think is because of my family background. Some of it honestly is because of being gay. Though I wasn't ever closeted, I truly believed that my personal life would be subject to attention, and I didn't want that kind of attention. Instead, I firmly believed that my work was what was relevant. But I was wrong, and this wouldn't be the first time. And I'll tell you about some of the wrongness that came about. I've always believed in democracy. From a little kid, I believed in the power of the people to do what is right, what is good, what is just, what is visionary, and I believe that there must be power to the people as well. Democracy demands it, but it's not a given. And when that power is denied, obfuscated, hidden, or diminished, we must be vigilant. Far too often, and especially today, it must be fought for and diligently protected. And I don't think I realized that until more recently. I've likely voted in every election I could. And admittedly, I was shocked when I moved to Wyoming 30-some years ago that elections take place only every other year. I come from New York, where you vote every year at least twice and sometimes 3 times, right? I like to vote late in the day. I like to chat with the poll workers, seeing how things have gone. I like the Italian cookies you used to get in New York from the Italian poll workers who averaged 105 years old, right? I like, who's from New York who knows that's so true, right? I listened to returns late into the night. But I want to tell you about one of the first campaigns I worked on when I was probably late teens, early 20s. And it was in Buffalo, New York, where I am now again. And I was handing out palm cards, something we did again in New York, for candidate Arthur Eve. Arthur Eve was running for mayor of Buffalo, a city at that time that was slightly under 500,000 people, so just a little bit, smaller than the state of Wyoming. He had served as the leader of the of the New York Assembly, right? Speaker of the Assembly, a very high prestigious job. He won the Democratic primary in Buffalo, and Buffalo is a supermajority Democrat city. Okay, he won the Democratic primary. His opponent, Jimmy Griffin, a good old boy Irish guy, got the Conservative Party line. There was a Conservative Party that made it on the ballot in New York. I was handing out palm cards for Arthur Eve, a Black man, and I was spit on by a little old Italian guy for handing out a palm card for a Black man. He could not believe, and I honestly look like who I am. I am Irish Catholic. He made an assumption that I was handing out cards for Jimmy Griffin, but I was spit on. It wasn't the first time that I ran into racism like that on the personal level. I was born in Troy, New York, a small city outside of Albany. It's an old industrial town known for making shirt collars and Uncle Sam. Believe it or not, for those of you who didn't know it, Uncle Sam is real. All right, and so we as kids used to have to do things like make pictures of Uncle Sam, and we used cotton balls, for his beard, because Uncle Sam was ours. I went to a 2,000 kid inner city parochial school, which blows the mind of my colleagues in the legislature, but a 2,000 kid parochial high school, the same one as my parents. The one that my mom graduated from, my dad was expelled from. We were told that he was expelled because of smoking, but you could still smoke at my high school when I was there. So we're pretty sure that that story wasn't true, right? My classmates like me were overwhelmingly white working class Catholics, typically Irish or Italian. So that being said, when I started high school, I was 13 and I turned 14 within a couple of weeks. I had a boyfriend who was Black that I had met in Drum and Bugle Corps. I was in Drum and Bugle Corps. So when my parents found out, I was basically grounded until I left home 4 years later. And the older boys in my high school threatened to throw me out a window. A violent but not uncommon punishment for anyone who transgressed race lines at that point in the East. And I still remember that I didn't pee beyond the second floor in high school until I was a senior, right? Confident that those boys were no longer there. So clearly, I still remember those experiences and they were formative. And while I know you don't have the same experiences or those moments, you have others. And ultimately, I'll ask you to think about them and their impact on you and to share them with others, because it will make all of the difference. So there's a lot to celebrate over the past century or two when it comes to democracy in our nation, and especially here in Wyoming, where our motto is the equality state, right? So let me hear some of those victories. Come on, I want to hear them from you. Come on. Oh, come on. Yes, Clara. We being in the 10th Circuit legalized marriage before the rest of the nation. What about 100 years ago, 125 years ago? Come on. All right. We've got suffrage. Yes. Abolition of slavery. We've got things to be proud of, right? All right. I want you to think about those kinds of things, right? And to think about how those were not easy victories, right? Though we're proud of them, to remember how much work it took to get to them. And then also that they weren't stagnant, right? That those victories came and they went, kind of like, right? Even if you think about something like the abolition of slavery, right? You think about the abolition of slavery in our nation's history, go to Reconstruction, things are looking pretty good, right? Then you go to Plessy versus Ferguson, holy God, right? All right, you have to go back, right? You have to think about the need for the voting right. We have 15th Amendment. You have to think about the need for the Voting Rights Act. You have to think about the Civil Rights Act, right? And then think about what's happening today. So though, even though we think about, right, those kinds of victories, and certainly they are, to think about that they also have a history to them that has been fought for and fought over and fought for. Okay. These attacks, even on something like voting, we see even now in Wyoming today. We see them based on ill-founded notions of the need to protect voting integrity, right? Moves that I think of as thinly veiled racism. I'm very concerned about the very recent attacks in Wyoming on representation in many forms. Wyoming is not unique in these attacks. In fact, those attacks are worse in some places elsewhere. But what's concerning to me that is unlike in the most recent past, these attacks on democracy here moves to decrease rather than increase representation are taking hold here. The so-called Freedom Caucus of the Wyoming legislature is part of a far-right national movement tied with former President Trump, right? Make no bones about it. Their membership is not simply old white men, okay? It isn't, right? It's diverse. It includes men, women, younger as well as older members, and people of color. They've split the Wyoming Republican Party and have successfully forced national anti-democratic issues to the forefront in Wyoming in both the legislature and I will argue at UW. Their profoundly anti-democratic rhetoric has infiltrated our media, all right, which Tennessee would definitely know of, and our popular consciousness. An article just last week outlined the Freedom Caucus's filing for a political action committee, which is how they can raise money to funnel to candidates. They announced a statewide roadshow to garner grassroots support with a goal to elect 10 more of its adherents to the Wyoming House of Representatives to push their agenda, an increasingly successful agenda that is confounding to me in its incoherence, but clearly designed to promote democratic participation to only its adherents and to restrict access to others. It's an agenda that purports individual freedoms while removing an individual's right to choose to have an abortion or gender-affirming health care. It's a movement that purports to protect and to champion girls and women while attempting to defund gender and women's studies at UW, and to champion educational choice while restricting children who are trans from school sports. While its members tout the evils of government, they advance the most draconian pieces of legislation with broad government overreach and punishment. And to illustrate how undemocratic their agenda is, it occurred to me that when their bills pass, and several of them have, the arguments that are made against them are about arguments regarding liberty, due process, equality, and privacy, fundamental cornerstones of democracy. And that's how they're argued against, because they must be, because that's what those bills are really about. They are challenges to those cornerstones of democracy. They have their specifics, but those cornerstones are what we need and are what we use to argue against them, because they go at the fundamental core of our democracy. So I want to share with you some of my experiences with each of these issues, the specific bills that have existed, their proponents that we've encountered, and that their proponents that we've encountered along the way. And here, and it occurred to me this morning, and I kind of told Scott, it's like, holy crap, I'm going to name names. All right, I'll probably call them afterwards. All right, and some of my colleagues. And because I want to talk about kind of my relationships with them. All right. Okay. In 2022, Wyoming was one of several states that introduced a bill that would forbid abortion if Dobbs was upheld by the Supreme Court. Dobbs was a case that overturned the Roe versus Wade decision that abortion was protected under the right to privacy articulated in the U.S. Constitution 14th Amendment. If Dobbs passed, as it did, regulations regarding abortion, if any, would become the purview of the states. Okay, so that's just a quick overview of what was going on. So the bill that was introduced before us in Wyoming was a cookie cutter version of what was happening elsewhere in the country, right? And it said that if Dobbs passed and the Wyoming Attorney General declared that it not inconsistent with current Wyoming statute, this bill forbidding all abortion would go into law. So I'm wholly pro-choice, right? I'm wholly pro-choice, but I scratched my head at the construction of the bill, right? That this bill would have our attorney general, someone who's appointed by the governor, right, based on language of a US Supreme Court decision, have a statute go into effect, right? That's kind of made up. So typically, if any action would be taken following a Supreme Court decision, it would be in the following year, again, with a Wyoming analysis and a Wyoming solution. And I remember walking the House chamber to defeat what's called a trigger bill. And I chose to talk with Republican attorneys, all of whom are in positions of power, all right, in the Wyoming legislature. And each of them assured me that, of course, that bill wouldn't pass. Of course, it wouldn't pass. No one will vote for a bill. They wouldn't vote for a bill that has Wyoming legislation depend on anything coming from DC, not Congress, the White House, or even the Supreme Court. And while I was chatting with them, and it's not like I'm in hush hush, we're just talking on the floor, I observed other Republicans observing us. And one of them, in complete sigh of relief, good. Now I don't have to vote for that awful bill either, right? Given what is kind of referred to as political cover, meaning that having an explanation for a vote that could appear to violate Republican principles by touting another Republican principle articulated by Republicans in power. In short, the trigger ban bill, while outlawing abortion, a Republican platform position, it violated a higher principle that we in Wyoming are never beholden to the feds or to DC. Okay. Instead, we craft Wyoming solutions to Wyoming problems with Wyoming laws. So I was relieved, right? Trigger bill, as far as I'm concerned, is going down, and boy, was I wrong, right? I was wrong. That trigger bill passed with overwhelming support. Okay. What we saw with the trigger ban is the success of an out-of-state concerted effort for one of the first times in anyone's memory past. It was one of the Freedom Caucus's first significant victories. But I'm pretty confident that if the issue was anything other than abortion, the bill would have failed. I think it's because abortion is highly tied to women. And while not all women want, can, or do become pregnant, and while not all men and those who are non-binary are incapable of pregnancy, restrictions regarding decision-making about abortion disproportionately impacts women and their healthcare providers. So I've been a big fan of Angela Davis since I was a teenager. I had to kind of look up and try to kind of remember. And her first book came out in '74. Right, to me, she's a big grown up, right? But I was still in high school, right? And my first year of college, right? Okay, so I'm going to quote Angela Davis in here. But a few weeks ago, if you remember, Angela Davis exhorted us to not take the victories of democracy for granted. They were hard fought to win, and then they must be hard fought to maintain. I thought a lot about that. Perhaps we've taken our hard fought victories regarding women a bit for granted. In the US, it was only 100 to 150 years ago that women and their allies, particularly people of color, fought hard for the ability to vote, to own property, to open a bank account, to make contracts, to enter certain professions and schools. More recently, to have domestic violence and rape by a spouse acknowledged as a crime, to define sexual harassment and discrimination as a violation of our constitutional rights, and to include birth control and abortion as protected privacy rights. When we think about it, women's rights to fully function in a democratic society are relatively recent and clearly tenuous. Another example to consider are the moves against acknowledging trans kids and their needs, as we heard about earlier today. Trans kids have always existed. Today, they're just more visible, right? And I think it's because of the LGBT movement, right? In my 30 years at UW, I've never not had a trans student, right? And I keep on saying that, right? And in part, it's because UW, for example, has always made reasonable accommodations when needed without much fuss. UW shouldn't act as if issues today are ones of first impression and need to be balanced with whatever, right? They are not, right? They are not. It's 30 years of history. right? The same with the state. I don't remember how long ago, my guess is about 10 years ago. The governor asked me to join him with a small group of school principals from around the state to think about how to accommodate trans kids when considering new school facilities. So you heard me 10 years ago, right? In thinking about school facilities, I sat with kind of principals from tiny communities, as well as the bigger ones, who were acknowledging that they had trans kids, and they were thinking about bathrooms and locker spaces. And how can we think about that in terms of school construction, right? Right. Nothing different came out of that conversation, but it was a conversation. It was a conversation that needed to have, and it was a conversation that put, guess who at center? The kids. It put the kids at center, not masses yelling, right? Not political arguments. These were principals who wanted to know how to best consider the needs of the kids in their schools. School activities, trans kids playing sports is not new either. The Wyoming School Activities Association has had a policy for years about how to address and how to handle situations that have come before it. For years, it's not new. Elsewhere in the country, states have simply declared that school sports are open to all based on a child's gender identity. For them, children should not be forced to be one gender all day at school, and when the school bell rings at 2:30 or 3, to need to switch to another gender to play sports, right? We know that trans kids are among the most at risk for bullying and suicide. They are among those who acceptance in school and out can make all the difference in their physical and mental well-being on their way to becoming adults. We know that school activities, including sports, are what gives kids some sense of belonging and pride, two elements that mitigate against suicide and depression. Wyoming isn't exempt from the national statistics. The Trevor Project reported that 3/4 of LGBTQ youth in Wyoming were bullied or harassed in 2022. 42% of LGBTQ youth in Wyoming seriously considered suicide, and 17% attempted. Even with this knowledge, bills were drafted to strip physicians and other healthcare providers from providing gender-affirming care. And the state legislature did pass a bill limiting the ability of the handful of trans kids in the state from playing middle and high school sports. The Trevor Project also reported that 90% of their respondents were negatively impacted by recent politics. We know that the kids are watching. The prime sponsor of the anti-trans kids in sports bill is a thoughtful, moderate Republican senator from Evanston, a retired teacher and coach. I like her very much. We served together on some committees, and we've even co-sponsored bills together. My heart sank when I saw that she sponsored the bill. And I'll be honest, I needed a moment, I needed a day to really think about it and acknowledge my reaction of hurt and anger. And then she just happened to be in my chamber. House member, she's a senator, I'm in the House, and I called her over to my desk. And I earnestly told her that if anyone else had prime sponsored the bill, she would have been the first person that I would have gone to ask to counter the bill. Because she, better than anyone, knew and understood the importance of sports to, in particular, the most vulnerable kids. And I was a little surprised. She immediately agreed. Right? She immediately agreed. She also agreed that we don't have many trans kids who are competitive athletes. And even if we did, that her bill was a sledgehammer that codified disparate treatment to appease an angry mob. But she then told me that she didn't personally know any trans kids, and she thought that some cis girls, right, might lose out. And she accepted the national rhetoric of that these bills were called Save Girl Sports. And then she came straight out and said to me that she needed some Republican street cred, right? That political cover that I talked a little bit about with the Dobbs decision, right? She needed that street cred, right? to counter her more moderate votes, that this was an issue that she believed in well enough to give her that credibility in her overwhelmingly Republican district, right? Wendy's bill flew through the Senate, even though Chris Rothfuss, Senator Rothfuss, fought diligently. And my understanding is the trans kids around the state knew what you did and so appreciated it. But that bill flew through the Senate and went to the House Education Committee, a committee that I'd served on for most of my 14 years in the legislature. If the bill was going to die, this was the place where it was going to die. The chair of the committee is a friend. I adore Dave and his wife, Astrid. And some of you might know Astrid more than Dave because Astrid is a community college professor up in Powell, right? You might have articulated with her. I adore them, right? We have had meals together. We have had long, sincere, meaningful conversations about education, about K through 12, about post-secondary education, right? Dave is back in the House after a failed run for a Senate seat. He fought hard to regain his seat against the far right wing. He lives in a part of Wyoming where the school board has met far into the night in order to choose the most conservative text out there, okay? Right? All agree that Dave ran an incredibly great committee meeting when the anti-trans bill came before it. Following his lead, the committee members listened carefully and questioned witnesses thoughtfully, including trans kids and their parents, who implored the committee to defeat the bill. When testimony closed, Dave sincerely and emotionally thanked the kids and their parents for their testimony and for their bravery. There are 9 peoples on the House Education Committee, with the chair voting last. I think surprising to everyone, the vote was 4-4. And I'm sitting in my living room in Buffalo, New York at the time, and I think you could hear a pin drop, just via what I was watching, waiting for the final vote. And with a crack in his voice, they voted aye to move that bill to the floor, right? Where it was assured, and it did pass, right? Tears came to my eyes. I yelled at the computer. I was sick. I was so angry and disappointed. I felt that Dave was cowardly and it was shameful, honestly, to me. Okay, so I do wonder about Wendy and Dave, about how they think about their roles in the passage of a bill that I think will undoubtedly cause fun. But I also wonder about myself, right? And my friendship with both of them, right? And so many other Republicans with whom I have served. Last summer, out of the blue, Wendy's husband of over 40 years died while riding his bike, literally days after his retirement party. I sent her a personal message of heartfelt condolences. I know that if Wendy or Dave showed up at my doorstep, right, they'd be invited in and I at theirs, right? I'm not so sure I would have done that 10 years ago, right? And I wonder about that, and I want you to help me think about it, right? Because it's not simply the adage that in the legislature, your enemy one day needs to be your friend the next day, or that we in the minority party must always cultivate relationships with majority members to get anything done. Our relationships aren't merely transactional. It's something more, and I think it's something that strikes at democracy for me. That being said, for now, hold on to that. What I don't wonder about is the recognition that this anti-trans bill, right, that directly impacts so few individuals is merely the tip of the iceberg. It's part of a concerted effort to limit who has full access to our most cherished institution and who has a voice at the table. All across the state, local school boards and community libraries are being called on to remove books that mass resistance. So an organization that showed up in Gillette to advocate censorship called the Destructive Marxist Cultural Agenda. This would be the library in Gillette, right? They wanted to remove any books that question notions of American exceptionalism, books that recognize the atrocities and impact of racism, and books that feature children who are not cisgender or that recognize queer families. Shoot, they want to get rid of books with penguin dads in it, right? For the kids watching, and we know that they are, when they, their friends, or their families are viciously removed from our collective sight and made invisible, when their mere existence on a school softball team is made illegal, their democratic representation is virtually impossible. It's not surprising that so many of our queer youth often look to get out of Dodge, to make their homes elsewhere, to me, the ultimate in disenfranchisement. These attacks have been seen at UW as well, with the attempts to defund and destroy the Gender and Women's Studies program and any programming that addresses gender. UW's Gender and Women's Studies program is one of the oldest in the nation. It's home of 3 of the recent Spitaleri Tobin winners, not to mention other top-notch students and faculty. Surely any debate about my department should have been quickly and unceremoniously squashed, as if it were moved to get rid of petroleum engineering, right? But it wasn't. I'm worried about the more general attacks on DEI and our new office MVP. Conservative columnist George Will's writings against DEI have been reprinted in our local and statewide newspapers. In February, our own Wildfile, right, printed an editorial by John T. Freeman, who is a self-avowed liberal, who decried UW's hiring of a VP for DEI, referring to it as cosmetic posturing, right? You know, forgive my snarkiness, but the author, while engaging us with his street cred about how he was a civil rights marcher, can't get around the confounding reality that racial disparities still exist despite his marching around the block 50 years ago, right? His argument in sum is that let's not waste our taxpayer dollars on DEI and endeavor in offices that make visible what the author so desperately wants shrouded. And let's face it, GWST hasn't been the only element of UW under attack. We have had Zoom bombings of scholarly talks, right? When the speakers are non-white. We have had attacks on individual students, as well as events that support the LGBTQ community. Clearly, UW needs a high-level administrative office to understand and to respond, as well as to promote necessary efforts for equity. Because again, the data doesn't lie. According to the university's own strategic plan, there is a desperate need to hire more faculty and administrators of color. There's a need to recruit more students, as well as faculty and support services to retain them. What the author of the Wildfile article called for instead of a DEI office was for nonprofits funded by philanthropies to advocate for change, right? And to me, clearly, he didn't understand what I'm going to call white dude hubris, right? To understand that those efforts have been in existence for years, right? For decades. They are not new, but they're simply not adequate. Clearly, I'm annoyed at him, right? I am annoyed at Mr. John T. Freeman, and I'm hurt and angry at Wendy and Dave, as well as so many others that voted for the anti-trans bill and abortion bans, and who never only recently supported Medicaid expansion, to name 1 or 2 of the zillion of issues that have come before the legislature. And I'm not so big of a person to say that I don't take it personally, because I do. So how do we continue to do this work when the challenges and disappointments before us are so great? And that, to me, is why I love the conception of the democracy layer, right? And your projects, because simply put, as Davis cautioned us, there is no one method, there is no one solution. It's never one and done. Whether it's making poems out of testimony, whether it's taking stories and doing an inverse curve to them, right? In terms of time that people get to kind of speak in relationship to the wages they have. These are fascinating projects. And again, I want to steal your images kind of thing. For Davis, for me, it's never one and done. The answer isn't marching only. The answer isn't, right, advocacy by nonprofits funded by philanthropies, nor is it a DEI office. However, it's not a DEI office either, right? It recently occurred to me, as I'm aging a bit, I think a little bit clunkily, that I think our efforts regarding democracy are perhaps somewhat like how we need to think about our own personal health. We can't take it for granted or take it for granted for too long. We have to pay attention, right? We have to work at it regularly. We need to eat well, exercise, get some sunshine, keep stress at bay, right? If you ignore your health for too long, things fall apart, right? Similarly, we must pay attention to our democracy if we want it to stay healthy. And while it's important to do things as individuals, like eat sensibly and exercise, we need to work together as well. Like, and is Linda still here? She was here. See, this is what happens when you walk out, right? That to cook food together and feed people, right? Or to go swimming with a good friend like Judy, right? Those are the kinds of things that we need in the same way to think about, right? What we as individuals can do for our democracy, but also what we can do together. We need to recognize that each of us brings different skills, different talents, different passions, and different visions to the challenges before us. We each have some strengths and weaknesses, and you've heard this before, but I want you to really, really think about and be honest about yours, right? Do an honest inventory. What are you good at? What are you okay at? What are you bad at? And what maybe you're just lazy at? All right, so I'll give you some of mine, right? I know I can work hard. I can work really hard, right? I'm analytical and I'm good with numbers. I can run meetings, right? I'm okay at speaking publicly, not great. So many are better. I can write reports, but I have the creativity of a gnat, right? I'm really bad at social media. I'm really bad at social media. I barely have learned how to hit the like button, right? And I think I have a lazy streak at times that chooses efficiency over quality, right? I also recognize that I did not come from a supportive family background, right? But so what? For me, I have amazing friends and colleagues who inspire me. I understand that it's important for me to use my skills. So this gets to the harder part, because our work on democracy is not simply an individual level and private, right? That's not enough. So yesterday, and you can see, I changed my ending because of yesterday. Yesterday, I don't know if any of you else heard it, but I heard an NPR story about Harry Belafonte, right? Yeah, right. Where his civil rights activism was referred to as a politics of accountability. I really like that, right? I like thinking about that. Being accountable to ourselves and to each other, understanding that there will be contradictions and messiness is necessary. Like I mentioned before, those relationships with Wendy and Dave, they're not merely transactional, they're more than that. And that took me a while to understand. To do the work of democracy, both to maintain it and to expand it, we have each other and we have tools. And one of the best of them is the humanities, which puts at its center of inquiry our attention to an exploration of the values we share and the challenges that we face. It's a tool that the Democracy Lab puts front and center. And I look forward to our future because of it. Thank you.